Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, your home for deer hunting news, stories, and strategies. And now, your host, Mark Kenyon.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. I'm your host, Mark Kenyon, and this is episode number 412. And today in the show, we're back for another one of our habitat-specific roundtables, with our focus being how to hunt deer in swamps, marshes, and wetlands, from Wisconsin all the way down to Florida. All right, welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, brought to you by Onyx. Today on the show, we're back here for another one of our habitat-specific roundtable, masterclass, whatever you want to call it. These things are, I think, they've been really interesting. We are drilling down to the nitty-gritty of hunting a very specific kind of habitat. And to do that, we get a bunch of different expert perspectives. As has been the case with all these roundtables that we've done so far this year, I'm joined by my buddy, Andy May, who I think most of you by now know is one of the best DIY deer hunters out there in the country. And he's also a swamp and marsh hunting expert himself. He does a lot of this up here in Michigan and elsewhere. So he's along to share his ideas, but he also nominated two other swamp specialists to round out our group today. First, we've got Joe Rentmeester. He's a Wisconsin public land bow hunter who many of you probably know from the Hunting Beast or the Hunting Public Land Challenges, or his past appearance on this show. But secondly, we've got Doug White, and he's a more under-the-radar guy. You might know him if you are a part of the Hunting Beast community. He goes by the name of PK there. But what makes him particularly unique and why I'm really excited that he's joining us here today is that he's finding and hunting great deer in swamps, but he's doing it down in Florida. I mean, some really tough stuff, very different than what we're dealing with in the Midwest in certain ways, but also interestingly similar. So that's what we have in store. This is a great episode. There's a lot to unpack, so I don't want to drag this out too long. I think we should just get right into it. Enjoy the show. Thanks for being here. Let's get into it. All right, here with me on the line, we have got a hell of a group. Talking swamp tonight, we've got Joe Rentmeester, Doug White, and Andy May. And I'll just thank you all from the get-go for taking the time to be here with us. And since we've got this 4-person format, which can sometimes get a little confusing, I'm going to just pitch it right to Andy to try to get us started. And Andy, as we've done with this series over the course of the last couple months, you know, you've kind of taken the lead on finding people who you really want to learn from about these specific habitat types. And I love that, because if you want to learn from these guys, I know that every single other person out there basically in the world can learn something too. So to kick us off, man, can you tell me, you know, a little bit about why you chose Joe and Doug, who they are, and what they have to share here?
Yeah. So we got Joe Rentmeester, who, you know, is pretty well known. He's a phenomenal hunter. And what I love about Joe is he's a young dude. Like he's very early still in his hunting career. But wise beyond his years. I try to think back to like when I was that age. And although I was doing pretty well, I don't think I had near the knowledge that Joe has, you know, at that same age. So he's just he's a great hunter. I've listened to his podcast. We talk through text message quite often, and he's just a guy that I'm learning from. I love the info he shares, like on podcasts and on the Hunting Beast and stuff. So I've just been real impressed with him. I know he hunts quite a bit of this, and he's had some experience hunting with a couple of other guys. One of his best buddies, who he speaks very high of, you know, as far as hunting swamps and marshes, and then of course Dan Infault. So, you know, he's had some good teachers and guys to learn from himself. So yeah. I think he's going to be an awesome guy to chat with. And then we got Doug White, who is also a Hunting Beast guy. You know, if you're a Hunting Beast member, this is PK, and he's He's very well known. He is Mr. Consistent. What's cool about him is he's very private, but he does share on the Hunting Beast. And when you hear him talk, you just like, all right, this guy gets it. He knows what he's talking about. And what I really wanted to have him on here because he hunts, for the most part, a completely different part of the country, but still hunts kind of the swamps and marsh type setting. So he's based out of Florida, and we'll let him dive into that a little bit. But like, I know nothing about that, and I'm guessing there's going to be some overlap as far as like what maybe you and I and Joe look for in swamps and marshes. I'm guessing there's going to be some overlap there with Doug, but I'm really interested to hear his take on this whole setting. So yeah, it should be a heck of a conversation, I think.
Yeah, we've got a nice mix of some solid Midwest experience, the upper Midwest experience, and of course, I know all four of us have traveled quite substantially around the country, and then Doug bringing in that unique Southern twist is going to make this a really good kind of overview of all things swamps, wetlands, marshes, etc. So Andy, where did you want to start with this?
Yeah, one more thing about Doug. That this it was a few years ago. Like I'm always blown away by his consistent success. He's always killing 2, 3, 4, I don't know how many bucks a year, but there was this one picture of him and he's on one of those paddle boards. I
saw this.
He's head to toe, all I could see is his eyes, and he's paddling out this nice buck out of some swamp down in Florida. And I'm like, who is this swamp murdering ninja here? Like, I need to talk to this guy. I mean, it was the greatest picture of all time. So, actually, I want to start with Doug. In fact, because I was having trouble coming up with questions for you specifically. So mainly because I'm not real familiar with the type of swamps and marshes that you have down there. So maybe if you could just explain some of the different types of settings that you're hunting down in Florida, and then maybe we can kind of relate that back to what we see up here. So Doug, if you want to take that away.
Yeah, man. Like most states, it's a lot of variation as you travel, mostly, from south to north. So basically out my back door is the Everglades, which is, very similar to a cattail swamp, except it's just vast and endless. Very, very few tree islands, some cypress, which is like a swamp type of tree. You have, some cypress strands and cypress heads, very few oak heads. As you travel up through the state, you get a lot of marshes that come out of obviously Florida has a lot of water systems. And around those water systems, you get a lot of marshes, swamps. I try to stay away from the canopied swamps, the big, vast canopied swamps. That's some real tough stuff to hunt. And then as you get up into North Florida, you get your ridges. You actually get a little bit of elevation, and then you get swamps down in the bottom. Very similar to like creek bottom type stuff.
When you travel, Doug, I know you travel to other states too. Do you find that your experience in the swamps of Florida translates to other wet areas around the country in the Midwest or wherever else you go, or is Florida just a beast of its own?
Florida, much of Florida, especially like peninsular Florida, it is very. I want to say it's different, but there's principles that carry over. Everything in Florida is kind of magnified. The pressure is unreal. The amount of deer in most places is just very low. So the things that you're keying in on, it's a lot more detail oriented. It's a lot harder in between. You get a lot more space in between deer. So, but it definitely carries over the principles of, obviously the deer, they got to bed on dry ground, they got to have places where they can travel and eat, and it's all the same stuff.
Yeah, man. Well, considering the challenges you're laying out there for Florida, and that I've kind of assumed from just things I've read in the past and heard from other people, the deer that you've pulled out of these spots in Florida is just doubly impressive. I mean, you've killed some really nice deer for anywhere, let alone the Everglades. I mean, that's pretty next level.
I appreciate that. Yeah, a lot of the nicer deer that I've killed have definitely come from like north of Lake Okeechobee. It's a lot harder. Of course, that one picture you were talking about, that was down south. But yeah, down south of the lake, it's real tough to find anything with some bone on its head.
Yeah, I bet. So Andy, the first thing that comes to my mind when I think about swamps is scouting with maps. That's the first thing that pops in my mind. But I'm curious, what's the first thing that pops into your mind when you started thinking about this topic? And are we thinking the same thing, or did you want to kick these guys in a different direction?
No, that's the first thing that I think about too. In fact, that's one of the reasons I like hunting swamps and marshes so much. I hunt quite a bit of this stuff, and I find it, at least where I'm at, I find it fairly easy to break down and hunt, but not easy to get into them, if that makes sense. So like the game plan, I feel like for me is it's fairly easy to figure out where to go and what to scout. Like the transition lines and all that are usually pretty clear. But what makes it hard a lot of the time is accessing it. A lot of time it's a lot of physical work, which can keep obviously the majority of the hunters out. I think like swamps and marshes tend to be better in high pressured areas because it just pushes the more mature deer into them. So I don't know if you guys kind of feel that same way, but like as far as cyber scouting and reading maps, like I find this the easiest to pick apart, but not necessarily the easiest to access. It requires a lot of physical labor a lot of times. Would you agree with that, Joe?
Yeah, so I would definitely agree with that. The one thing if you throw in there is cedar swamps. If you were to look at like a cedar swamp on a map, that's where you really, in my opinion, you really can't decipher much. I mean, cedar swamps still have transitions and you can still kind of find those. But with the cedar swamps, you really have to get into them and kind of pick them apart. You have to kind of get in there on foot. So that part I would say is a little bit different.
Yeah, we have some of that up north in northern Michigan. I've actually never hunted like a true cedar swamp. I've hunted tamarack. I've hunted like tag alders, lots of like the red osier dogwood, just a lot of cattail marshes and whatnot. But the cedar swamps, we have quite a bit of that up north, but I've actually never hunted it. And I've heard the same thing. I've heard it could be very difficult. How about you, Doug, as far as like reading the maps? Is that pretty much what you start with?
Yeah, for sure. I'm a big map guy. I mean, I live in South Florida, so a lot of places I hunt, it's a drive. I can't really put boots on the ground. I hunt giant tracts of land. So basically, I am narrowing down a lot on the map. And there might be some huge pieces of public that I might not even really go to because I can't narrow down on the map because it's not the right sort of terrain. You got those giant swamps. If they don't have good hard edges or like deep water edges or something that I can key in on the map, unless I have some intel on that place or, something like that, I might just write that place off and go somewhere that's more catered to, my style and a little more efficient.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit, Doug? Because I read you write something about this where you said that you'll avoid areas with these soft edges, as you called them, or kind of indistinct rolling terrain, stuff like that, and that you really, as you just said, really look for those hard edges. Can you explain like what you mean by that and what that looks like on a map? Because I'm imagining when someone's trying to figure out how to pick apart a swamp when looking at a map at first glance, for new people at least, that could be intimidating.
It can be hard even when you've been doing it forever, especially if you're going to travel to new places and new swamps where you've never been in that area. And I've I've done that where I've looked at maps and thought, and ended up when I'm standing there, what I thought was the high ground was the low ground and vice versa. So you kind of have to take everything with a grain of salt. But as far as maps where what the terrain looks like, what the vegetation looks like, and you can see it on the map, basically, people have different terms for the edge types, soft edge, hard edge. To me, a hard edge is if I'm on the edge of that swamp, and, I'll just keep it for Florida guys. If you got cypress on your right and you got, say, pines on your left, and you can, say, reach out with your right hand, touch the cypress, and you can reach out with your left and touch the pines, that's a hard edge. You got a hard line right there. But if it kind of bleeds in and say it takes 50 yards, 100 yards where it's mixed cypress and pines, it's going to be a lot harder to nail down exactly where that deer is going to move through there. So I don't know. And what it looks like on the map, I mean, if you know what the different types of trees look like or the different types of vegetation, I mean, it's just going to be literally a hard line where those two vegetation types meet. You don't want to see them really blended together. In some cases you might, if you're gun hunting. I like that kind of stuff. But if you're talking mostly like bow hunting, I know a lot of guys who listen to this are hardcore bow hunters. So, I mean, you're really trying to nail down where that deer is going to walk. And it just makes it a lot easier when you got the defined terrain. And like you said, with rolling terrain, same thing for hill country. I look for the steepest stuff I can find, and I look for places that only have a little bit of it, so I know where to key in on, because otherwise you've got the same problem of everything looks good everywhere, and you can't be everywhere.
Yeah. Joe, do you look for something similar when it comes to kind of prioritizing areas that have that really distinct hard edge?
Not necessarily. Because when you have that around here, it seems when you have that hard edge, you also have other people finding the same spots and pushing the deer out of there pretty fast. So then you end up finding yourselves in those spots that don't have the hard edge, that are a little bit more difficult to find out and figure out. So I mean, I guess just really, yeah.
So that's interesting. So then when you're looking at the map, then if the hard edge for you isn't working as well up in Wisconsin or that part, what on the maps are you keying in on otherwise?
Sure. So you can still kind of catch I'm thinking of a local swamp near me. You could still kind of catch little points that jet out or jet in. So like, let's say you have a line of cedars and cattails, and it's more of a soft line. You can still kind of see those spots where the soft line might dip in or the soft line might dip out. And that's where I like to check. And you usually have a trail either running into the cedars or out of the cedars. Those are great starting points, but then it's tricky because there can be that one lone high tree out in the cattails that is holding bedding that everyone's going past, or it can be very deceiving. So, I mean, it's a starting point, but gosh, you really want to tear through an entire swamp like that and just kind of pick it apart, in my opinion.
What else, Doug, for you? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Andy.
Sorry, I was going to cut in real quick. Just to go off of what Joe was saying, I see the same thing. I see, I end up finding a lot of the buck bedding on some of those feathered edges. Like it might be where a hardwoods point kind of comes down into, say, the marsh or swamp, but then off of that, it might go down into some tag altars and then kind of turn into more like dogwood. So like on a map, it kind of looks feathered. You can still see an edge in a point that kind of goes out into the marsh, but it's different stages of like vegetation. And a lot of times I'll find the bedding like in that dogwood that's kind of out into the marsh a little bit, but it just looks a little thicker. Like on the map, it looks like a little thicker, a little more structure than, say, the cattails that are just beyond that. And then like Joe said, like a lot of times there'll be like a lone tree out there or a small tiny island. It could be the size of like a 500 square foot house or something, or 100 or 1,000 square foot house. Sometimes I'll find them in there, but a lot of times we don't have that real distinct edge. It kind of feathers out into there. So it's kind of interesting to hear the differences there.
Yeah. So back to you, Doug, then you're looking for the hard edges, which maybe is a little different than what we're seeing up here. What about the other things that Andy and Joe just mentioned, stuff like those points jutting in and out or those little islands? Is that something?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, they're spot on, and really, and I didn't really get too much into it, but like with those hard edges, I very rarely find bucks bedded right up there. And obviously, like Joe said, if it's a good looking hard edge and it's pretty easy to get to, you can bet you're going to find a stand every, few hundred yards. But it gives you a starting point, like Joe said. And then, then you're looking for those more subtle, those little tucked away spots where those bucks like to hang out and let the other deer and people walk right by them sometimes, or they're tucked way back in. But I'm definitely seeing what they're saying also.
Okay. And on these maps, what are the things that you're looking for, like kind of visually on these maps to clue you in on some of those other features? Like it's really easy to understand a really clear, hard edge when I'm looking at a map. But for someone down south that has maybe a little bit different kind of wetland, are islands easy to identify? Are those little high spots easy to identify when looking at an aerial map? Or what little clues are you looking for on that side of things with the maps?
Yes and no. Sorry. Yeah, yes and no. Sometimes they are very clear. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes it takes, walking around in certain terrain and figuring out what stuff actually looks like on the map. I've had buddies send me pins. They say, man, this looks like a good little clearing, inside of this swamp. And I'm like, that's a gator hole. That's a pond. That's not, it's going to be chest to head high water. Just because I've walked through so many of those places. So some of it is easy to see, if there's a pine tree that's in the middle of cypress and you get a picture where those, the cypress aren't green where they drop their needles. I mean, you're going to see that pine tree or that palm tree. If you got a good resolution, on the aerial map. But yes, a lot of times it is easy to see. But then when I see that, like Joe said, if you see it, man, other people are probably seeing it. So you kind of got to base that off. You got to go in there and see, is somebody else hitting it, or not.
Yeah. I'll tell you what, you mentioned one of my biggest issues I have up here in Michigan is when you find those gator holes. Those things are real tricky up here in Michigan. I gotta tell you what. I tell you what, I cannot imagine hunting in a spot where there could be gators as you're hiking in. Man, props to you.
No, yeah, they're just part of life down here. And I mean, for the most part, they don't want nothing to do with you.
All right. I'll take your word for it. I don't know if this is the right next step here, but I think we probably need to just spell out a little bit more of the basic building blocks of swamp hunting, in that we've kind of mentioned you look for edges, you look for points, you look for islands, but we haven't really talked about why that stuff matters. Like, how are these deer using these different features in a swamp? We all know because we've talked about this stuff before, but there's probably some people out there who don't. So I don't know. Joe, do you want to take a first stab at kind of describing why some of these key features that you mentioned matter? Like, where are these bucks bedding? How are these deer traveling? What kind of stuff are they feeding on or heading to feed on? Can you kind of lay out what you see up in your area? And then we'll bounce to both Andy and Doug too. I'd like to hear.
Yeah. So one thing I guess I kind of want to backpedal on a little bit that'll blend in with what you're asking. Time of the year makes a big difference for us up here in the north, where I guess I'm curious too in Florida how time of the year changes things. But in the winter, for example, you're not necessarily going to see the deer on the points, because the points, you got ice, you got snow, people are getting into those swamps. You got cold weather, and you start seeing the deer up by us getting pushed into like your cedars. And then where particularly in the cedars, I find them usually are in your tightest clusters of cedars. They almost stick out on a map. Like if you were to look at a cedar swamp on a map, you'd see like a real tight, dark spot where you get maybe say 10 cedar trees just clustered really tight together. And they seem to just bed under those in those types of spots. And in the winter, part of it is they're getting out of the wind, in my opinion. And they have food right there, the cedars themselves. So time of the year makes a big difference. And refresh me again. I was going to kind of blend it into your question there. What was your question?
Yeah, I was just going to ask you to describe how you typically see deer using some of these key features. So you just mentioned one of them being one of the kinds of spots they bed. But if you could kind of run down, like, these types of features are where I typically see them bedding. These are how I typically see them traveling, using different edges or points or whatever, feeding too. Just a little overview of those types of things would be helpful to kind of lay the stage.
Yeah. So I guess for the bedding, it's just, it seems those lone, when things are wet and there's not a ton of pressure, those lone single trees that have a little base underneath them just seem to hold the deer pretty well. If there's not a lot of pressure, in my experience, they're not usually terribly deep into the swamp. If you got people right on the edge or getting into the swamp a little ways, the deer might be pressured in deeper. I've also seen it too, where you get so much pressure in the swamps, deer will come out of the swamps and they'll be bedded in your overlooked spots. And then I guess to touch on food, I mean, food, when you're trying to pick out a swamp too, food is so important in regards to what swamps are holding the deer. In the early season, I guess, if you have a swamp with new seeding alfalfa butted up against it, you can bet there's going to be deer coming out on that side of it, in comparison to, say, a swamp that's just surrounded by, hardwoods that isn't dropping acorns. So that's another thing, is really for us figuring out where that food is and if the deer are even going to be in those swamps. Because I've got swamps up here that are awesome at certain times of the year, and they're vacant of deer at other times of the year. So I guess that kind of gets you going on that topic.
Yeah. Since sticking in the Midwest kind of area, Andy, what would you add to this part of the country and how you're seeing deer use this stuff?
Yeah, I see a lot of the same things. Just kind of going back to like some of the features where, you know, if I'm talking, I mean, I guess we're kind of talking about bucks here, specifically mature bucks. You know, I'm definitely, you know, we all know about, you know, the points that kind of jut out into the marsh or swamp. Like Joe said, if there's water, anything that's high ground, which could be, you know, a lone tree out there or a little island of, you know, tag alders or a lot of this stuff, I don't even know what it is out there. It's just like high ground where there's like little trees. I see them bedding on that. Bowls, like along the transition where it kind of goes, it's like the opposite of a point. It kind of goes in. I've seen them bed right there on that kind of transition too. The one thing that I actually learned this from Joe's buddy, I think is Marsh Buster on the Hunting Beast, but I listened to one of his podcasts, and he was talking about how even just different pockets of vegetation, it doesn't necessarily need to be trees, but like a different type of vegetation out in the marsh that's like slightly different. A lot of times those are really not so easy to see on the map. But after I heard that, I heard that like a year ago, and I started looking for that on the map and started scouting out some of those spots on some public land around here. And sure enough, I found some bedding in there too. So, yeah, all that stuff I mentioned, I see the bedding. And then one thing too, like with the cattail marsh, and that's really cool. And we all know this, and most people do now, especially with mapping technology, but you could really zoom in on those on like Google Earth and really see like those trails like in such detail, and you can it will literally it's like a blinking sign going to, you know, where some of these deer are bedded, and then you can go out and verify, you know, with boots on the ground. And then to kind of piggyback off what Joe said as far as like which marshes and swamps are holding deer during certain times of the year, like a lot of my experiences in like cattail marshes that have a lot of dogwood around, and those seem to really pile in deer there during the winter. And I know they like to browse on the dogwood and stuff, but that's been some of my best late season spots is in some of those dogwood swamps there. But it's kind of interesting to hear him touch on that. I wanted to dive into that a little more later, but how about Doug? Could you go off to some of the features that you see down there in Florida? Some of the same stuff, maybe?
Yeah, a lot of it is real similar. And as far as, I think the question was like why it's important. I mean, it's important because obviously the deer relate to the terrain. That's their home, you know? So if you can find those points and those little islands and those little trees, one thing I'll say, well, when you get a lot of pressure, I see bucks kind of using those lone tree type beds. Not a terrible amount though. I've found that down here, they really like a little spot where they've got a canopy and they've got shade. That you know, it gets so hot. I think it's just a really big deal for them. That's what I've been finding with a lot of the mature bucks that in the last few years I've been paying more attention to it, because I'd see one of those lone trees out there and I'd go stomping out to it thinking that, there's going to be, and there's not a bed there. I'm like, man, it's too perfect. But then they're up, and it depends, like I said, with the pressure, because pressure will definitely push them out there. And also the amount of deer. If there's too many deer up in the more favorable spots, then it'll push them out there. And then, and another big thing is just the way that they seem to always be set up for some sort of wind or thermal advantage. It just almost every single big buck that I've seen moving or have found, where he's hanging out, where he's bedding, it just seems like they are always keying in on where that wind kind of funnels through, or where those thermals are dropping and sinking.
It seems like, well, it doesn't seem. I know I'm completely clueless when it comes to figuring out how and where the deer down by you would be feeding. I can understand the bedding. The bedding seems like somewhat consistent with what we have up here. But I'm trying to figure out how, like, my understanding of food sources would translate down to the south and down in the stuff you're in, and I'm not sure it does. Like, what kind of stuff are they feeding on down in this swampy, wet country? And how, like, what are you looking for when trying to figure that out?
So number one is the same as with you guys, pretty much. It's going to be oaks. White oak. We get a lot of water oaks, live oaks, and the deer will definitely come up and hit those. But honestly, I am not real. That's something that I've been trying to step up my game with, is food source and identifying. But honestly, I don't. Down here, these deer they nip here and there. It's really similar. If I could put it into is big woods. What I hear those guys talk about hunting in the big woods up in the Northeast, that translates really well to what I've seen in most of Florida. They're going to browse. A lot of times there is food right in their bedding, as far as browse. And if it is in a really wet area, they eat a lot of aquatic plants. I see them feeding in the water a lot.
That makes sense. Well, the next step, I guess, in my mind, is taking all this digital scouting. We're looking at maps. We're looking for these features. We're laying down waypoints. So this looks like a good point. This looks like a good island. This looks like an edge worth checking out. And then, of course, if you have the time, hopefully you're going to get a chance to go out there and check it in person, ground truth it in some kind of way. Doug, I've read that you don't have a lot of time to do on-the-ground scouting anymore, so you focus primarily on in-person or online, or maybe a little bit of in-season stuff. But can you lay out for me, with your limited time, when you get some kind of available bandwidth to get some on-the-ground scouting in, like, what is the key thing that you're focusing on, or something unique that you key in on, other than, like, you're going to go look at this stuff? Is there any more detail you can provide as far as the stuff that you're specifically really focusing on or prioritizing?
Down here in most of Florida, I would, even though I'm not a big guy on sign, hunting over sign, if you can find some good sign, because there's just not as many older deer, and when they make sign, usually it's for a reason. So definitely finding some better buck sign is a huge thing, and if you can correlate it then to what you either already have scouted on the map or can look at there on the fly, and kind of piece the puzzle together on why that sign is there, and if you can make a game plan. So yeah, honestly, if I'm trying to scout, I'm usually not scouting to look to see what the terrain looks like. Usually I know what it's going to look like pretty well. It's more of trying to, ground proof as far as, is there, a good one around here? I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. What's quote unquote good sign look like in Florida? Because I'm guessing it might look a little different than good sign in Iowa.
Yeah, I've never been to Iowa. I've not had the pleasure, but I've been to Missouri. That's about the closest. And yeah, it's very different. There are some small places, some small parts of the state where there's actually pretty good deer numbers and you can get into some better sign. But, for most of Florida, good buck sign, for some guys, it might be any buck sign like that, anything might get them fired up. I'm looking for bigger than average rubs, bigger than average tracks. If I'm doing the kind of scouting, like where I'm actually looking for beds and obviously bigger beds, even though we don't usually get those well-defined beds, you can generally, if there's something there you can look at, you can tell kind of the size of the deer that's been laying there. So yeah, I mean, it's the same thing that you would look for anywhere else. It's just scaled down. I mean, the big sign, the big tracks that I'm looking for might look like doe tracks in the Midwest.
Yeah. And what about a bigger than average rub? What's a bigger than average rub look like by you?
Anything that, man, that's tough to answer, but anything that's getting up where the center of the rub is up above your knee, that's going to be a 2-year-old or better deer. And then we do get the occasional, I've seen some places that were ripped up where it's, the rubs are up to your chest, and that's usually a deer that has pretty long tines or a pretty wide rack, or is, tall, or maybe all those things, hopefully.
Yeah. Okay. Joe, what about you when it comes to your on the ground work? Is there anything kind of unique that you're looking for other than just like confirming that, yes, this stuff you saw on the map has some sign? Anything kind of next level or specific that you do that maybe is a little bit different than others?
I wouldn't say, next level, but to kind of take it a slightly different direction. Not necessarily even just maps. For us, we have to confirm that there's big deer living in the area. So shining is a big one that I'm assuming they don't do in Florida. I don't know. I shouldn't assume that they don't do it in Florida, but just confirming deer exist in an area through shining, and what fields they're using and what areas they're in. I guess I'd be curious if that's something in Florida or not.
You are legally allowed to shine, I believe. I don't do it, so I don't know if there's time frames. I know you definitely cannot have no weapons in the car.
Yeah.
Right.
I got a question for Joe. Sorry, go ahead, Joe.
No, go ahead.
All right, sorry about that. So I'm curious what you're seeing kind of up there around Wisconsin. Can you kind of touch on a little bit of like where, maybe like in the marsh type setting, where you're seeing doe bedding as opposed to buck bedding, and then also just kind of maybe blend that into like where in your experience have the biggest, oldest bucks? Has there been a certain type of feature or type of pocket of cover where you've seen the biggest, oldest bucks bedding?
Sure. So in the swamps, I've seen spots where you just have one solo buck kind of bedding on some bogs, and then the next year that buck is gone and you've got 8 or 10 does on those same bogs. I've seen that. I guess where the biggest, oldest ones are is usually some freak overlooked spot. I know it's kind of a cliche thing to say nowadays, but like you take a look at, for the listeners, if you watched my one video of the buck I shot over his bed, he was with a great big old buck and just a little point that wasn't getting bothered. Now that's not swamp, I guess, but that's an overlooked spot. There was another one, really, the buck got very old. And when we finally did find where he was hanging out, it was between three parking lots, kind of down in some little cattails, just a little hole next to like a little creek. It seems like it's those overlooked spots. If it's too obvious of a spot, they just don't make it to an old age.
Yeah, that's kind of been my experience too. It's like it's either the overlooked or it's just those ones that are just like so hard to get to. Like they're the farthest away from access, or it's just there's some sort of barrier, like a river or some standing water or something that you got to get to. It's just like, it seems like those two things are where I found, either the biggest bucks or the biggest buck sign. But that it could be any one of those features that we talked about. It could be, a little tiny island. It could be a lone tree out there, or even some of that dogwood. But it just seems like those two things are where, if I really think back, where I found the oldest and the biggest bucks. What about you, Doug? Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, it's tough because, like you guys know, it's all so situational. But I'll say it seems like the biggest, oldest ones they're very rarely actually in those spots where you look at a map and it's like a neon sign. I mean, once in a while, like you said, if they're real far from access or something like that, they'll be using that traditional stuff. But it seems like the ones that are kind of sliding through, like the seams, the gaps in the pressure, they've got some little spot that works for them. And a lot of times what I've been finding lately is they like those I don't really know what they're called. They're not exactly a point of dry ground, but they're more like, I call them like a belly. It's sort of like a kidney bean shape, little knob, a little bit higher ground. And they seem to really like that because it doesn't just give them this real small little spot. It gives them kind of like their own little area. And like I said, if it has that overhead canopy with the shade, it's got browse, if it's got, security on the backside, whether that's deep water or cattails or whatever. It seems to be that when I'm finding, like if I shoot one and backtrack them to its bed or if I happen to jump one or something like that, it seems to be in the last few years, I've been noticing that they're in these spots that are just subtle and they don't really scream at you. Even if you walk right by it, I've found a few within the last few years where I've walked within bow range of that bed several times and never knew it was there. And that kind of stuff is kind of hard, to relay, on a podcast. But if you spend your time out there and you really comb through stuff, one thing I've been telling guys is if you know a big buck is in like a certain area and you can't find them, man, turn on your GPS tracker and grid it like you're looking for a shed or you're looking for a dead deer, because sometimes you are literally walking right by them.
Yeah.
That's good stuff.
Andy, what about you on the, you just mentioned a little bit on that front, but back to the on the ground stuff. Doug just mentioned sometimes you've got to grid search an area almost to really identify those little hidden spots. You just seem to be a master of scouting anything, but I know this stuff in particular. Is there anything you would add when it comes to the on the ground side of scouting out these swamps and wetlands? Is there something you do uniquely or something that's particularly important to you other than just covering a lot of ground?
I always have said, like, I don't think necessarily that I'm the best at reading maps or even picking up things, scouting as some of these guys out there. But what I will say is I'm very, very thorough. Like, I will scout the same areas multiple times. Even though I've walked everything, I will walk it multiple times because I miss stuff. I miss stuff that I'm sure some other guys wouldn't. And it often takes me, I think I pick up on the obvious stuff. But it often takes me 2 or 3 or 4 times, say, scouting a marsh to really get a grasp of everything. So I will purposely go out there. There's this one in particular that I'm really trying to learn. I've had a couple of good encounters out there. It was a couple of good encounters 2 years ago, and then that same buck was out there this year. And I've been out there 3 times in the last week and a half. And it's not that big a piece, but I'm really just trying to dissect it. And it seems like every time I go out there, I learn a little bit more. And I've always thought this about myself too. It often takes me a few years to really kind of master a certain area. Yes, I can often dive in and take a good buck out, but to really learn it intimately, I feel like I'm a little slower than some guys that, I don't know. I'm not sure exactly why, but I feel like I'm a little slower to pick that up. So I actually spend more time. I might take 2 or 3 times as much time out there as, a guy like Joe or a guy like Dan or Doug. I don't know that for sure, but I don't think so. That's what I have to do.
Nope.
I think we're in the same boat, and that's exactly what I was alluding to. Is I've spent, I don't even want to know how much time reading maps, and thought I was pretty good at it. And like I said, some of these spots I've hunted them for years, and like you said, scouting the spot 2 or 3 times, even doing it within a short period of time, going back that second and third time, I think a lot of guys, they scout something and they say, well, I scouted it. Just like they'll look at a map and they'll say, okay, well, I know what that looks like. But when you stare at that map and then you shut it down and the next day you stare at that map again and you stare at it again, new things pop out at you. And that happens for me. It happens looking at the map, and it happens on, boots on the ground all the time, man.
Yeah. Well, that's good. That's good to hear. That makes me not feel so bad. But I feel like, I pretty much, I do what you guys do. I work those transitions and then I branch out from there, but I comb it the whole thing. Like, honestly, like you said, Doug, like I'm looking for a dead buck, because that's the only way I can make sense of everything, to be honest with you. I don't think I'm quite as good as like reading a map. Although I do think marshes in particular are some of the easiest to read. I don't think I'm as good at it as some guys. So I do need to be just extremely thorough. And often I need multiple hunting seasons out there to really get it. And then things start coming together, and then I find it. I feel like I end up finding it really easy to hunt once I figure that out. But it takes me a while to get there, even though I might take a good buck out, early on. It takes me a while to get there where I feel like I really have it figured out.
So should we move on to some of the actual hunting kind of styles then? Because if we've kind of covered well the things to look for when you're preparing, scouting with your map, scouting in person, scouring this stuff, trying to learn it. But it's a whole nother step than trying to take that information and actually apply it once hunting season's open. I don't know. Andy, how do you want to, I don't know where your head was at with this, but do you have any thoughts on how you want to start this part of the conversation, or should we just start basic and just see favorite ways to approach hunting swamps? What do you want to do?
Yeah, let's do that. Let's maybe have them dive into a couple of different scenarios, maybe that they've experienced, or some tactics that they use, say like maybe like that early season in the swamps or marshes, kind of some textbook stuff, or maybe a couple stories of some mature bucks you've taken. And then I'd be more interested too to hear about the rut in the swamps and marshes, because I haven't had as much success in those areas during the rut. I've killed some deer there, but most of my success has come early to mid-October to that late October timeframe. And then I don't know, I just haven't had quite the consistency during the rut in that type of setting. So I'd be curious. So, and going even into late season too, because Joe, I know you've had some great late season hunts in the marsh. So how about we start with you?
Yeah, so that's a tricky one. Gosh, in the early season, the biggest thing is do they know they're being hunted yet or not? Because you can catch them. I mean, like I said earlier, right on the edges of the swamps, it seems, where they're not pushed in deep. They're not. It almost seems like they're not bedded so much with their nose in mind. And then once the pressure hits, it seems like now they start bedding with their nose and their eyes. If they can use their eyes in the swamps, it's a little bit harder. But sometimes you get like a hillside where people are walking down into a swamp, and the deer are watching that a lot of times. So yeah, once the pressure hits, it kind of seems to change during the rut. For me, I'm kind of in the same boat as you. I had a little more success this past year during the rut getting onto deer. The big thing I noticed in the swamps during the rut is when a deer is in a certain area, whether he's with does or not with does, it seems like he's just in that area for a few days and then he's gone. And then he might loop back through a few days later and then he's gone. And that's kind of something I've noticed with the wireless trail cameras. And then in the late season, the late season, it changes so much. So like up by us in the late season, you might have a 30-degree day or you might have a minus 10-degree day. And in those swamps, they shift around so much. So they might be, when it's a little warmer, they might be kind of in the dogwood, in the open, chewing on dogwood where they don't mind a little wind getting to them. When it gets a little bit colder, a little nastier, then they're tucked back in the real thick stuff, seems like keep the wind off of them. So it really varies. And I guess when I think about it in all those scenarios, one thing I see a lot of is when you have a buck using a bed or using a spot, it doesn't seem like it's for a real long period of time. He's there for a short window, and if you don't capitalize on it, he's off doing something else, or it's going to be a few days before he's back through there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I was out scouting last week, and I sent this polo, which is it's like a video message app. I was sending it to Joe Elsinger and Justin Wright of this little cattail marsh where there's this little island in the middle of it, and it's small. I mean, it's the size of like my living room. And there was a Boone and Crockett sized buck that I was hunting here in Michigan a few years ago. And he lived across this major highway. And every year during the rut, he would venture across into the side that I can hunt. And I had hunted him the year before. He was like a low 150s 8. And, that's when I really kind of figured out his pattern. I was like, okay, I'm definitely going to kill this buck next year. And I was all in on this buck. In fact, the whole season, I was basically foregoing everything else locally. And I was every night that I was sitting observation just so I knew exactly when this buck got into that marsh, because that's what he had done the year before. And it was like late October, and all of a sudden he started showing up in that marsh, and I could see him out in there, and he wouldn't move far off that island in daylight. And to be honest with you, there's the property line where I was hunting. Like, I couldn't actually hunt the marsh, but I could hunt right up to the edge of it. And he just wasn't coming my direction in daylight, but he had the year prior as the season went on, like into the rut. So I was just biding my time, observing. I started seeing this deer. I started getting pictures of him after dark. And then it was like, an hour before, or an hour after dark, then 30 minutes after dark. I mean, it was accumulating exactly how I thought this would play out. And it was just about time to move in and start hunting this deer, like in some funnel areas. And he ended up getting poached out of some guy's backyard over by the highway there. A guy shot him with his handgun out of his car. But the reason I bring that up is because he showed up in that little marsh just for a very brief time. He wasn't there before and he wasn't there after. But if you didn't know that, you would never have a chance at this buck. But it was very cool. I sent the video of that little bedding area. But yeah, that brings back a heartbreaking memory.
That's a painful one. Now, Andy, if you could have hunted that spot, let's say it was all open to you, and you were hunting those observation stands all those days leading up to it, then you finally see he's here. What would you have done differently if you could have hunted right in there? Can you describe exactly how you would have approached trying to hunt him if you didn't need to wait off back on the edge like you did?
Yeah, so where I could access to, I could see about 150 yards, 200 yards into that marsh. And he needed to come my way, but he was going parallel to me. So he was actually working out of that island. The few times I saw him in daylight, he was slowly kind of working out of that island. He was nipping on some red brush, just kind of browsing. And then he was working his way up, like into the fringe area where the hardwoods kind of dip down into the marsh. So he was making it to the edge. Like, if I could have hunted that edge, it was like like we talked about a bowl, like where the hard edge or where the edge of the woods creates a bowl instead of a point. He was working right into that. So had I been able to access that property, I could have gotten a crack at him there, probably in that late October timeframe. But what he was doing is he was kind of slowly getting out of his bed, and he's working up into that. And then he was laying down sign. He was really starting to hit the scrapes and rubbing up his area and stuff. He was just basically keeping tabs on the does, just starting to check on the area. And then when the doe started coming in heat, that's when we really started, seeing him move. So there were guys hunting that property. They had no clue that's where he was. I knew, just because the history and the sightings and the trail camera data, I kind of put it all together. But it was very interesting because they were all hunting up near the food, which was quite a ways away. And this buck wasn't making it anywhere near, there in daylight. In fact, when he would make it over to where I was hunting, like the year prior, he was doing it all via like security cover. He was never like showing himself out in the open. So it was very interesting how that deer was just living right under their nose and moving right under their nose. But that's a testament of like how most hunters, a lot of the average hunters out there, they'll sit on that field edge and they'll see 20, 30 does and handful of younger bucks, but that big one is surviving back in there in the cover. So
yeah. Did you want to pitch that same question you had for Joe a second ago, Doug's way? You might maybe repeat it because I forgot what it was even, so maybe Doug did too.
Yeah. So, basically, maybe touch on your strategy of hunting in the swamps or marshes, kind of early season, kind of taper that into like the mid-season rut, and then maybe even late season a little bit. I know that's a long open-ended question, but you can kind of touch on your strategy there.
I will do my best. I love hearing you guys talk about all the history that you get with bucks. That's awesome. I don't run cameras or any of that, so I don't get to do that. But I think the way that you and Joe, the way that you're able to figure out deer is just incredible. But anyways, so what I find, and I think Joe said the same thing in early season. I've made this mistake of over hunting a swamp, you might say. I've done this both in state and out of state. To where I'm trying to dive in and those deer aren't in there yet. Unless there's food in there, unless there's oaks back in there, those deer are generally, like Joe said, they're out on the edges. What I've actually found, it's kind of funny, is it seems like those batch of groups of bucks will be also where they can watch access. And it's like the first time that a hunter comes in there and you blow them out of there, they won't be back in there again until next summer. So you got to be real careful. Because once you kind of go in and they know, it's hard early season. Once they know they're getting hunted, it's really hard to kill them. That's been my experience there. But you definitely can do it. The one great thing I will say, early season, not so much in my state, but out of state, is if you can get into like that mid-September, those bigger deer are pretty much all rubbed out. And if you can find those rubs, I mean, you're going to be in the money. And that's a really good thing for somebody that's just kind of traveling, just looking for any good buck, that's something that I've had some good success really keying in on. And then once you get to, I guess closer to the rut, I mean, everybody kind of knows how to hunt the rut, the funnels. And I like a lot of, what I key in on a lot is like the deeper water, because it forms sort of like a back wall. Deer, obviously they swim great. I've seen them swim rivers and lakes. I've yet to see a deer really swim across deep water in a swamp, unless they're getting out to a bog or something like that. But so what I like to do is find where those deer are cutting around that water, and if I can access somehow behind that, whether it's wading through some deeper water and then actually climbing up, like say there's a cypress tree that's in that water, and I never have to cross that trail. It's just money, because a lot of times that deeper water, especially if there's sun hitting it, it's going to pull those thermals. As soon as in the evening and the morning, it's going to pull those thermals. And then once sun comes up, obviously your thermals are going to be going up, and I've just found it to be really bulletproof. And then late season, I really don't have much experience with late season, because our rut in Florida goes all the way through into March into some parts. So once we hit the rut, I pretty much follow the rut all through the year.
Doug,
cool.
I've read you describe your hunting style as, quote, a by any means necessary style. What does that mean, and why is that so effective for you, especially in places maybe like this swampy country?
I think it's effective like anywhere. If you can get out of your own mind and out of the box of what everybody tells you of how you have to kill deer, and then how you have to kill a big buck. You see a guy like Justin Wright, the way that he's killing these deer is phenomenal. He's sliding in the bedrooms, and sometimes killing them the same day that he's bumped them. And a lot of guys would tell you that's, and I know Andre DeQuisto kind of marketed that whole thing But, I've kind of developed the same thing of, if you're doing what everybody else is doing, you're going to get the same thing. So, I kind of thought to myself when I was younger is, you don't want to just be a deer hunter. You got to be different. You got to figure out something that's different. And I mean, even like still hunting through flooded areas, guys will tell you, I mean, you can't still hunt through a flooded area unless you know how to walk silently, which is a discipline in itself, walking through water and not making noise. So, I think just getting outside of the box, using your head. And I think one of the biggest things is understand, if you're going for mature deer, is understanding how they use their nose. Because so many times, the game is over before you even know you're in the game. So I don't know. That was a bunch of,
there's a lot
not too clear.
There's a lot to unpack there. There's some good stuff. I have to ask about walking silently in the water. You said that's a tough thing to do on its own. So how do you pull that off? Anyone who hunts in a swamp will probably have to do something like this, whether it's in gator country or beaver country, or points in between. So what's your trick to pulling that off?
Just going slow, being silent. And there's certain depths of water too. When you get, I don't know how deep it actually, maybe it seems like maybe 8 to 10 inches of water, you can move at a pretty good clip and make minimal to no noise. But sometimes if it's shallower water and you got muck, I mean, you're literally having to lift your foot up out, wait for the drips to come off, slide your foot back in. And obviously you're not doing that for miles. You're kind of bumping into a spot where you're expecting to maybe run into a deer, either bedded or moving through that area, and you're just sliding through. I mean, it's just like still hunting in the woods, like crunchy leaves. You got to work around with what you got. But yeah, it's mostly balance comes into it too. In that muck, when you pick your one foot up, you better have some balance. Otherwise, you're going to make a lot of noise when you go stampering sideways.
Yeah, I understand that when you do this still hunting through standing water, that you do some what you call cover calling. Can you describe that?
Yeah, I've done that in the past. I really haven't done that lately, but basically, like if you're sliding into an area, and if you do it enough and you jump enough bucks, you kind of get a sense for like, man, I feel like there might be a buck right up there. And a lot of times when you get into these areas, when you get back into these, because usually when I'm still hunting one of these flooded areas, it's because you really can't hunt it from a tree. You really can't hunt it from the ground effectively unless you went in and cut lanes, whatever before. This is an area where a deer has, unless they're doing drives and stuff like that, they have not come in contact with humans being in there hunting them, especially a human that can walk slowly and quietly through the water. Usually they know from, half a mile away, here comes a guy sloshing through the water, and they know right where you are and when you're coming. And when you can slide in there quiet and then you make a few calls, even old bucks, I mean, they're sure it's another deer. Like there's no doubt in their mind, because there's no way that somebody could have slipped in there on them. And I found that to be effective. Like I said, I don't do a lot of that anymore. Mostly because I don't hunt those areas as much. I hunt further up north where there's better deer.
I hear you. Anything else when it comes to trying that still hunting approach in any kind of swamp? Any other considerations, when you plan to do that, if there's certain days that you would do it and others you wouldn't, or certain situations, or anything?
Yep. Definitely try to stay away from doing it on the weekends. I've gotten several bucks killed, either by other hunters. I actually jumped one up and got hit by a car. You got to be careful about what you're doing when you're moving those deer around on public land. If you do that, I mean, and obviously I'm also really not doing it during prime time. I mean, the worst thing is to come sliding up on somebody, or like I said, you jump a deer and then he gets shot or shot at or whatever. So yeah, midday, I like to do it. So I said I don't do a lot of late season hunting, but there is one area that I do hunt. It would be considered late season. It's well after the rut. And that is actually how I like to hunt that area, because I can scout it while I hunt it. Generally late season, midday, not a lot of guys in the woods. You bump a deer around, he's generally going to be all right. So yeah, I definitely, and then like during the rut, you do have some guys who will sit all day. So you might not want to do it too much when other hunters are in the woods. That'd be my thing.
Yeah. Andy or Joe, do either one of you guys employ the ground approach in the swamp too? I can imagine I've done it myself actually, where there's situations where, there's some reason to want to be in a spot, but there's not a good tree. There's a lot of swamps where there's just cattails or just stringy little nasty trees, and there's nowhere good to get elevated. Andy, is that something that you're thinking about often, and have you pulled it off?
Yeah, I have. I do a lot of still hunting, but I haven't done much in the swamps or marshes. I have hunted from the ground or very, very low, like out of the saddle. I've talked to Joe a little bit about this because a lot of times you get some. Sometimes it's hard to find good trees, especially where you need to be for some of these older bucks. A lot of times there's these hardwood islands or points that go down. And yeah, if they're coming up into there in daylight, like Joe said, maybe early before the pressure really hits and maybe you got some acorns dropping, then it's a little easier. You can probably find a good tree to get into. But when they're staying out there and they're maybe only getting to that transition edge or not quite getting up into the high ground in daylight, a lot of those trees on the edge they're not really conducive for a tree stand or saddle. Some of them you can get just low. And like what I've told Joe about is a lot of times I'll find a tree like that and I'll set up in the saddle literally at ground level or 6 inches or a foot up and just use that tree as my cover. And then I got basically a ground level shot, and I might be covering a trail or 1 or 2 trails or a scrape right on the edge or something like that. But a lot of times I'll be hunting just right from the ground, and I'll just tuck myself, kind of in the shadows, like off to the side, kind of, I guess, perpendicular or off to the side of where I expect movement to be. I haven't done a large amount of that, but I've done a fair amount. And I know Joe, I'll let him get to this, but I know he's told me of a couple situations where he's hunted from the ground on some of those islands, like way out there. And I think his buddy does that quite a bit. So Joe, what do you got in that regard?
Yeah, I'm not going to be the expert in ground hunting, and that's where we got to get Jordan on one of these podcasts. But Jordan has done super well because you get these, like you kind of mentioned earlier, is you get these high spots. There's no trees around, and he'll just tuck himself kind of down into the cattails, say 20 yards from the bed. And a lot of times those deer are only moving 20 yards before dark, and he's just sitting on their trail or off to the side of their trail. And when they come through, you got to be ready. You have a split second to get that shot in there. So I wouldn't be the best person to talk to about doing it on the ground. Now, like Andy, I believe you said that big 6-pointer that you shot this year in Ohio, that you did that with the saddle. Your feet were on the ground, right? And you were kind of leaning back in the saddle.
Yeah, I was. I actually had the platform, but the platform literally was like 5 inches off the ground. So that wasn't really. It wasn't really swamp, but it was. It was very. It was swamp like. It was very tall grass, like kind of like CRP, like very tall, weedy stuff with some pockets of cover. So it did kind of was similar to like a cattail marsh in some sorts. But yeah, I was basically at eye level, and that's the way I've set up a lot of times in the marsh there too, right on the edge.
And that's another good point too. In the swamps, you have to be so careful in trees because you don't have that many trees. And once you start sliding up one, suddenly you've got eyeballs looking at you, and you don't even know that it's happening. Whereas, say you're hunting hardwoods or farmland, you could climb trees and deer can't see you. But in the swamps, it's a little different. You have to, you got to make that decision. Do I really want to climb this tree? Is it going to burn me if I climb this tree? So that's something kind of different in the swamps too.
Can you describe, like, in a situation like that where you think that you could be within eyeball range of a bedded deer and you're worried about getting too high up there, have you found any kind of sweet spot I know it's going to be dependent on the tree and a lot of specifics, but if you had to say, like, man, if I can get at least 6 or 7 or 9 or 10, or is there any kind of like sweet spot that you typically try to get into that's low enough that you're not going to get eyeballed, but high enough that you're still out of, most sight, or anything you're thinking about? Maybe I'm asking an impossible question, but anything you think about in that situation.
No. Yeah, not necessarily. I think what it comes down to is in the swamps, a lot of times you have your one trail that you're shooting, and you got to get up just high enough that you could shoot that trail. But then you do kind of run into the problem. You got to consider the deer are going to be sunk down into the muck. So now is their whole belly going to be covered up? So you got to make sure you can get high enough to make a good shot to that trail where you're expecting the deer to come through. But you got to also not be so high that the entire rest of the swamp can see you. You almost just have to use your gut, use your best instinct. Consider where all the deer are bedding and think to yourself, can they see me? Obviously, if you scouted in spring, you can figure a lot of that out. But when you're hunting in the moment, you don't have that luxury,
Yeah. Bouncing over to you, Doug, on this topic of trees. I've read a handful of interesting things I keep referring back to that made me very interested in your style. And one of the things is that you are very particular and patient when it comes to picking the right tree. Supposedly sometimes taking 30 to 45 minutes just standing there thinking about it. Sometimes I feel like I do the same thing. Can you tell me, is that accurate? Do you still do that? Why do you do that?
Very accurate, man.
Okay. And then walk me through your thought process. Like, what are the things you're thinking about to get to that final decision?
Yeah, sometimes I'm trying to help pick a tree, like for my buddy or whatever, and I think that like they think that I'm zoning out, but really you're dropping milkweed. You're looking at what it's doing when the wind's blowing. You're looking at what it's doing when the wind stops. You're looking at what you think it's going to do when the sun sets, and the thermals kick in. But sometimes I think a lot of stuff like what Joe's talking about. You really don't have too many tree options, so you have to get in where you can and like he said, he stole the words out of my mouth, is like basically just high enough to get a shot. It's like as high as necessary, as low as possible is the way that I like to hunt. But, and then what's going through my head is, like Joe said, if you got one trail, it's pretty easy to see where that deer is going to come out. But if it's a little more like ambiguous, then you got to really kind of dissect it as far as the options of where that deer is going to come out. And where you can shoot to from which tree. And then obviously, like I said, your wind, because you can't have your wind going the wrong way. At least not when he's going to come by, which, that's a different thing, is sometimes the wind's going the wrong way, but it's going to settle down and those thermals are going to kick in and he's probably not going to come by until after that. So you set up for that. But yeah, it's probably would be funny if some people could watch me stand there and look at 3 different trees for 30 minutes.
You brought up the wind. Let's talk a little bit about the unique wind or thermal impacts when hunting in swamps, especially when you've got standing water. I would imagine there's some different impacts. I've seen some different impacts there. Is that something you can describe at all in your situation, Doug? Are the temperature swings wild by you, or is it always kind of hot and humid? I have no idea how that might impact thermals or wind changes and stuff like that. What's going on for you in that?
Yeah, so it is pretty wild. Temperature changes usually, but like early, like September, October, it's usually hot, humid, muggy, even at night. But yeah, like you said, with the thermals, I think one of the big things down here that I've noticed is like, it's so hot. The sun is so intense that I think that it really heats up any of that water that it can get to. If you walk in there in the morning before sunrise, a lot of times I wear like jungle boots or sneakers or whatever. And it's like stepping in bath water. If you're stepping through a space that is like exposed when the sun is up. So even all through the night, that water is warm. And that definitely pulls a lot of thermal activity. It's almost like a magnet, like a thermal magnet, and it just sucks everything from around, from the dry ground.
So how then do you factor that into, planning where to hunt and how to, pull a fast one on a buck that seemingly would be able to take advantage of that?
Yeah. So, the bucks are definitely keying in on that, where they can, but You just have to find a spot where you can get in. And a lot of times I really like to hunt below the water line, because a lot of times those bucks are kind of right there at the water line, right below it, depending on what the terrain is, what the pressure is. And if you can find a way to access it and climb down thermal of him, you're kind of in his blind spot, and it usually works out pretty well.
I'm not following you. How are you hunting below the water line? What do you mean by that?
So basically, where the water, so if you're walking from the dry ground toward a swamp, at one point your feet are going to start getting wet. And then as you go deeper into the swamp, that water is going to get deeper. So depending, and that water line is obviously right where the water starts, or
I gotcha.
Where the water usually is. And that's generally within that area, depending on the terrain, depending on how fast, the terrain falls off and gets deeper. It's going to dictate where that deer travels most of the time, but he's generally going to travel at or below that water line to catch all those thermals that are getting sucked in from the dry ground.
I follow you now. Okay. Joe, would you add anything when it comes to wind or thermals in wet, swampy stuff?
So exactly what he said. If you've got the option to sit on the edge of a swamp or just into the swamp, I think that's kind of what he's saying. He nailed it on the head. You kind of want to be in the swamp because at last light, you got your scent sucking down into there. I guess from a more broad perspective, for me, with your more open cattail swamps around here, the wind is pretty consistent. I mean, you can almost look and see what the prevailing wind is, and that's what it's going to be. You've always got those different little things that can kind of mess up winds in certain spots, so you got to pay attention. When you get into the cedar swamps, that's where the wind gets really sketchy and it really starts to swirl. And I guess that's another thing that just makes cedar swamps so difficult to hunt, is you do have those swirly spots. And you say you get a west wind and it might swirl one way, you get an east wind, it'll swirl a completely different way. And that, I think, dictates the bedding a little bit too. In those cedar swamps, I've got one spot where a hill kind of butts up to the back of it, and the winds will kind of swirl around that hill, and the deer will bed right at the bottom of that hill in the cedars, and it can be very difficult in the cedars, I guess, is my experience.
Yeah, I hear you there. Andy, what about you? Would you add anything on that one?
No, I think they pretty much covered it. The water thermal thing, that took me a long time to figure out, by the way. I felt like an idiot. Like, I was getting busted so much, and I never figured that out. It might have been from someone on the Hunting Beast when years ago, when they finally clued me into what the heck was going on there. Like, even hunting like water holes, early in the season, like I'd have the wind in my favor and things would die down, and it felt like I'd still have a slight wind advantage, and deer would come into the water hole or to take a drink, and I'd get busted. So it took me years to kind of figure that out, and then I started hunting it, using it more to my advantage. So there's one spot in particular in this marsh where I used to kind of blaze through the cattails, and there was a sweet tree that was basically this. It's like a creek bottom, but on each side of the creek bottom is like cattails, and then red osier dogwood, and then it kind of blends into like some oak ridges and then fields. But anyway, the way that it's shaped, it tapers down, and like all along that creek bottom is bedding. And during the rut, it was just an awesome travel corridor for bucks. And it kind of pinched down in this one area where I like to hunt. And there was this one tree that was kind of out in the middle of this funnel, and it was just in the perfect location. It was a great tree with great cover, and I hunted it, and deer would often pass by between me and the water. They're the creek bottom edge in the evening, and I would get busted early. This is early season where it's still kind of getting warm. The temperatures are warm during the day, and then they cool, but the water temperature is still warm, and that's where you're starting to get that. I would get that pull there, and I could not figure it out. And then finally I got clued in onto that. So I started paying more attention. Well, then I started coming in, I started wading through that creek, and there was a tree that was literally, I step up right off the bank and I climbed my tree. It was right on the edge. And then all of a sudden I could hunt that spot, and I was completely bulletproof. And it took me a while to figure that out. And I wasn't quite where I needed to be for archery range shots. There were some deer that passed by in range and some that were just out of range. But what's cool about that spot is I could hunt it repeatedly. As long as I had a somewhat of an east wind, even if it dwindled down to light and variable, I could count on those thermals to pull towards the water. And, I would drop milkweed. It would go right to that water, and then it would kind of follow the way that the stream was running. But it was cool. I mean, I literally could hunt that. If I wanted to hunt that 10 days in a row during the rut, I could. I would not get busted. And I killed a lot of deer out of that tree. But it was good when that pull would happen when the temperatures were still, getting up into the 70s, 60s, even 50s. But once it started getting colder, that pull wasn't nearly as strong and sometimes non-existent. So that's something to keep in mind too.
It's a great example. Andy, I know you've got to bounce here pretty soon, and we're going to wrap this up entirely here pretty quick too. But do you have a final question or topic you want to run by these guys before you got to take off?
Yeah, I got one question. So we talked, Doug, you mentioned it. Joe, I know you think about this too quite a bit. In the swamps and or marshes, there's going to be some bedding that is wind specific. That they usually bed here with this type of wind coming off the land, coming off the high ground or whatever. And then there's going to be these other spots that are more any type wind where they could be there on any given day and most days. Can you, from your guys' experience, can you maybe touch on a few of those or where, because of the terrain and the features, it's a wind specific bed? And if if the wind isn't blowing out of this direction off this piece of high ground or whatever, they aren't there. And maybe some other examples of any wind type bedding. Let's start with Doug.
Oh boy. Okay. So I would say most of the beds that I know of are any wind. It's very, very rare for me to find a bed that I think is wind specific, mainly because I feel like in the swamp, it's not just the wind. I think they're mainly, what I've found by me is they're mainly keying in on those thermals, the thermal activity. And then they're also using at least one, if not two other senses, meaning they're using their sense of sight, or they're using a lot of times a sense of hearing. And I think that they just feel so secure when there is standing water around them, especially if they can see up toward the dry land where anybody would normally come from. I just feel like they're bulletproof. And I will say, I do think they gravitate to those spots that are in favor for them for the most predominant winds, or prevailing, I forget which term is right, but the wind that is most common. And also I found kind of spots where the terrain, I find a lot like in broken terrain, where it's kind of open, maybe it's kind of brushy, and then there's like some scattered, maybe like islands of trees where those little islands will actually kind of pinball the wind, and it seems to always pinball it into the same spot or toward the same eye, and those bucks seem to key in on that. I'm trying to think of one that is wind specific, and I just can't think of one that I've ever found. And I also don't run the cameras like you guys do a lot, so I don't have enough intel to say like, yeah, this buck is here every time on a north wind, and he's never here on a south wind. It's not something that I've found.
Yeah. How about you, Jim?
All right, Joe. Yep.
Yeah, I was afraid to say it, but he said exactly what I was thinking. I just don't see that much wind specific, and I think it's. I'm just going to repeat everything he said. It seems like it's just more that they feel so secure in there. And I think what it really comes down to is their nose. They haven't smelled humans in those swamps for, say, weeks or months, and they just feel so secure in there that if a human does come tromping through there, they're going to hear it, and they're going to be able to get out of there in time. I don't see it that often. Now, before I talked about that one, the cedar swamp situation where when the wind is hitting, if you could picture like a rectangular cedar swamp with a circular hill on the side of it. When the wind is hitting the side of the hill that the cedar swamp is not on, it seems like the wind almost comes around both sides of that hill and kind of meets right in that one spot. And then there's a lot of deer. In my experience, in that particular spot, I've seen it where you could just count on deer being in there, but to hunt it is extremely difficult. But yeah, I haven't seen that much wind specific. I'd be curious to hear what Mark and Andy have to say on this.
Yeah, Andy.
Just real quick, I wanted to piggyback on that. Sorry. What he said about like that island or that hill, I do see that as well. And sometimes they will kind of position themselves a little bit different for the wind, but I don't see them bedding in a completely different area just because the wind is switching.
I know you got to bounce, Andy, but do you have 30 seconds to give us an example of this wind-specific bedding?
Yeah, I'm good as long as I'm done at like 7:45. I'm good. So
okay,
you can edit that out. Sorry.
Well, what do you got?
Okay, so it's obviously really hard to prove this, right? Because we don't know if the deer are there. I feel like the times that I have seen where I think it's more wind specific is when they're bedded like right off of a point. And a lot of times that wind is coming like down off the point, off like the main woods or the main high ground. And they're bedded right off that point, maybe a little clump of trees like right off that point in the cattails or something. I feel like if there's any that's wind specific, it's that. Now, as far as like the islands or, the pockets that are way out there in the marsh or the lone trees where it's like kind of surrounded all by thick cover, all by cattails or all by, good security cover. I feel like those are more any wind. But I'm not going to go out and say for sure that they're only bet on those points, on a specific wind, because I've hunted them when the wind isn't quite like that, and I've still had deer come in. I haven't killed a good one with the wind like blowing right in my face on a point, but I have killed a couple off of a point with my wind blowing out into the swamp, and it's just missing that bed. So I don't know. I defer to someone who has more experience, I guess. I have a lot of experience in this type of setting, but I don't know that I'm confident enough to say one way or the other. But if I was going to point to one that it seems more wind specific is when there's a point coming off the main ground, the main woods, going out into the marsh, and the deer are bedded like right off that point.
Makes sense, at least.
One thing, if I can add one thing. So, well, it kind of seems like we're all kind of saying the common thing. It doesn't there's a lot of non-wind specific bedding. One thing that is very specific with the wind is how early they seem to be willing to get up and actually move. So, I mean, if you've got it where the wind is, if they can leave their bed and have the wind in their nose, it seems like they're much more willing to get up early versus if they don't have it in their nose and they can't scent check as they're coming out of the swamp, it seems like they'll move a little bit later. So that's one. Well, a lot of the bedding doesn't seem specifically wind specific. How they move in and out of it and what time they do does seem that way.
Yeah, that's a good point too. They could have been there and just not getting to where I was in daylight. That's why I said it's kind of hard to prove. But yeah, I don't know. That's good stuff to hear you guys say that you don't see much wind specific though. That's pretty eye opening, because I was kind of convinced on the point thing that I had it figured out, but maybe not.
But you might have the points figured out. I think it also has to do with how many options the buck has. If there's different points that are good for different major winds, then maybe he does bounce around to the best point for that day. But I just don't have enough experience with tracking specific bucks on specific wind to really say that is or isn't.
I love the level of like nuance you can get with this kind of stuff. Like I don't have enough experience in this specific instance to say anything, but I just geek out about the fact that there is something to say about it. Like the fact that we can sit here and kind of go back and forth about all the little intricacies of how these bucks might use these specific terrain features. Like that is why hunting and really diving deep into a specific kind of habitat just fascinates me. like just trying to really understand how these puzzle pieces go together at this level of detail, it's the top of the peak, I think, when it comes to deer hunting. It's just fun, let alone how successful it can make you be. It's just fun. In that being the case, though, as much as I'm enjoying this, I do need to wrap things up on my end. So I want to just end with a quick rapid fire kind of question for each one of you guys, and kind of leave it there. And my question I'd like you each to give me your take on is what you think the biggest mistake is that most people make when hunting in a swamp. Like, what's that one big thing or one specific, maybe it's not the biggest, but if it's one specific thing that you think matters a lot, that a lot of guys or girls are probably screwing up on in this terrain. Joe, what jumps out to you first?
Yeah, the first thing, and it's the thing I did wrong for the longest, is just messing around too much. You know, you kind of you read some sign, you think you figure out a spot, and you're just in there too much, messing around. And you just really need to stay out of those spots. And when they're ready, or when you know that deer's coming out of there, jump in and kill them. This is the biggest thing, is people just mess around too much.
All right, Doug.
I got two on my mind. One is access, but everybody pounds access, the importance of it. But one big thing that I found in Florida is sitting all day. Guys think that bucks don't move because it gets too hot. And most of the deer that I've killed have been between like 10 and 3-ish. And a lot of them over 90 degrees. Those bucks will get up and move. So pack your lunch. That's my tip.
Wow. And what about you, Andy? One final mistake that you want to make sure I don't make next year?
I'd say most guys get intimidated by it as far as accessing where you really need to go to get into the big ones. So if you can get past, the mental block of maybe having to wade in, up to your belly button, or to kayak in through some stuff that you're not sure you're going to get out of, or, walk in sinking up to your knees. If you can get past that, I don't think that they're terribly hard to hunt, but some of these spots that you need to get to the older bucks are hard to get to. So if you can be mentally tough enough to do that, I think you'll be way ahead of the average guy out there.
Wise words. All right, Andy, Doug, Joe, thank you all. This has been a lot of fun, and I know there's a lot of folks that are going to benefit from it. So thank you.
It was fun, man. I enjoyed it. Thanks.
Yep. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.
All right. And that is a wrap. I hope you guys learned as much as I did in this one. Man, there's so many places across the country where there are swamps or wetlands or marshes or cattail, potholes, whatever it might be that you can apply these kinds of ideas to. So I'm hoping a lot of you are going to be able to take this to the woods and use it this fall. With that said, I will just offer a couple quick reminders. Number one, make sure you are signed up for our Whitetail Weekly newsletter. It's the place that we share all of our new whitetail content from the Meat Eater and Wired Hunt team. You can go to themeateater.com to sign up. Secondly, make sure you're following Wired Hunt on Instagram. And I think that's it for the moment. A lot of exciting news to come in the next couple weeks. I'll be sharing that with you soon. But until then, thank you for being here. Thanks for your attention. And stay wired to hunt.